Do you find yourself getting distracted or spending hours working but hardly getting anything done? Have you ever experienced those times where you get more done in 1 hour than you normally get done in an entire day? This is what's called deep work, or sometimes referred to as a flow state. And imagine how much you could get done if you could work like that on demand. Imagine yourself 5 years from now and how much you could accomplish. This is exactly what the best-selling book Deep Work, written by Cal Newport, a professor of computer science and productivity expert, is all about. And in this video, I'll unpack the key concepts I learned from this book after studying it for weeks on end. But instead of just spamming through a long list of things you need to implement in your life, I'm going to go through a mind map that I created while reading this book. This will help you not only understand why each of these ideas are important, but also help you relate all of these ideas in your mind so that you can better actually remember, but also apply these ideas in your life. And at its core, the book is about deep work, a state where you're hyper-focused and pushing your cognitive abilities to the limit. And the book first discusses why the state of deep work is so important. And it then moves on to discuss how you can actually get into a state of deep work more often. When discussing why it is important, the first argument that Cal Newport presents is that it can help you increase your output. The easiest way to understand this is that your output is really just a function of 3 variables. The first one is quite easy to understand, and that is the more time you put in, usually the more output you get. If you work 20 hours, you usually get more done than if you work 5. However, this isn't a hard fast rule because there are 2 other factors to this equation. The second factor is leverage. An easy way to understand this is with an example. Because if Elon Musk was to put in an hour of work, he might be able to make a couple million or $billion. Whereas if, say, someone who works at Subway or McDonald's put in an hour of work, they might only earn $10. And so although they put in the same amount of time, one can get a lot more out than the other. And leverage itself is also a factor of 3 smaller variables. The first one is skill. Because let's say you're performing a task like coding. If you're a more skilled coder, well then you'll get more done. The second one is tools. Maybe you're still a coder, but now you have an access to an AI that helps code for you. Well, you're going to get a lot more done a lot quicker. And number 3 is the actual importance of the task itself. Because if you're completing a very mundane and unimportant task, then even if you're very skilled, you have great tools and you've put a lot of time in, it's really not going to move the needle that much because it's not important. And the final factor that increases your output is the actual focus that you put in. Because you could work for 20 hours, as you could be working on an important task for 20 hours with the best skills and the best tools at your disposal, but if you're just not focused, then you're not going to get anything done. And the key here is that 2 of these factors can be directly optimized with deep work. Because when you're in a state of deep work, you're number 1, way more focused, and number 2, you're pushing your cognitive abilities. And cognitively demanding tasks roughly correlate to a more important task. And so being in a state of deep work helps you increase the importance and focus and therefore increase the output. The great thing here as well is that if deep work can help you increase the output, well, one output that you could have is learning the skills and how to actually use the tools that will give you even more leverage. And so you can argue that deep work also helps you learn those things and increase your leverage to an even greater extent. And so that's the first reason why deep work is so important, is it helps you drastically increase your output. Cal Newport also continues to add to say that this ability to increase your output is actually becoming increasingly valuable in today's society. The first reason for this is the ability to focus is becoming a lot more rare. And this is resulting from the ever-increasing amount of distraction in our society. And secondly, it's becoming more valuable because there's more competition in the workforce today. Because number 1, people can work remotely, so you're not only competing with the people in your town, you're competing with the people around the world. And number 2, the tools at our disposal are getting a lot better. So the output of 20 people can now be outputted by a single person with a good tool. Just like how the invention and use of a tractor completely changed the face of agriculture and enabled one person to output that of hundreds. And so this ability to have a greater output is actually becoming increasingly important in today's society. The second reason why deep work is important is because it's fundamentally fulfilling. And if you've ever actually been in a state of deep work or flow, then you can probably testify to this yourself. It feels incredibly rewarding to get all of this done and to hyper-focus and be incredibly productive. So deep work in itself is incredibly fulfilling. There's also two more clear arguments that you can make in this case. The first argument is your life is effectively the sum of all the experiences that you have, and your experiences are dictated by what you give your attention to. And so if you have the ability to control what you give your attention to, or to control what you focus on, you have the ability to improve your quality of life through experiencing things that give you fulfillment. The second argument is that people don't actually want to be relaxed, because then they're just going to become bored. And so a state of pure relaxation isn't actually always what makes us happy. Instead, it's that feeling of getting something done that is important, something that's meaningful, that can really lead to our long-term happiness. So in summary, there are two reasons why deep work is important. Number one, because it's fulfilling, and number two, because it increases our output. The book also quickly addresses the potential paradox of, if deep work really is that important, then why do we not see it that much in our society? And well, there are four factors that lead to this. The first factor that leads to this paradox is there are a few outliers in our society where deep work actually isn't that important for their job. One common example is that of a CEO. There's many CEOs that describe their day-to-day as just effectively walking around and conducting various meetings and talking with various people. They're never actually in that state of pure deep work where they sit there for a solid block of time by themselves, concentrating on one task. Instead, they're constantly talking to different people and sharing their opinion. And so a CEO could argue that they don't actually need deep work, and that is actually fair because the way they provide value is really just sharing their informed opinion. And so they themselves don't have to actually perform deep work. The people under them do. However, these are just outliers. For most people, deep work will drastically improve their output. The second factor that's contributing to this paradox is the fact that it's incredibly hard to quantify the impacts of deep work. It's very hard to show that it's increasing the output or making employees more fulfilled because there's just so many variables. It's just so hard to actually study this field. And so it's hard to actually find that data and show people. Another factor is that humans have a default nature to do the easiest thing. Deep work is not easy. Deep work takes focus and concentration and pushing your cognitive abilities to the limits. And so it's the opposite of easy. So we default to more shallow work because it's easier, and that's human nature. And the final, most significant factor is the fact that there's a couple common misconceptions in today's society that contributes to prioritizing shallow over deep work. And the fact that there are outliers and the fact that it's hard to quantify the effect of deep work also leads into these misconceptions. The first misconception is a lot of people think that being busy is the same thing as being productive. And being busy, doing lots of shallow work, sending tons of emails, doing tons of meetings, it makes you feel busy and it makes people feel productive. But it's not actually productive. There are more productive things you can be doing. The second misconception is that using the internet is always good. And this stems from the fact that the internet has made so many new things possible that if someone says they don't, say, use the internet or they don't like using the internet at times, they're seen as out of date or out of touch. But although the internet is incredibly powerful and a vital part to work, it can also be a thing that leads to a huge amount of distraction in your life and degrades your productivity. And so it has to be used with balance. The third misconception is that if you decrease your distractions, you're effectively saying that you're decreasing your chance to connect with other people and to connect with your colleagues. And so that can reduce your fulfillment and the sense of camaraderie in the workplace. And the final misconception is that if you decrease the amount of distractions to increase your deep work, you're going to actually decrease your chance for creativity. And this is very similar to the above misconception where people think that if you're just stuck doing work by yourself, you're not going to be exposed to outside ideas and other people from other departments in your work stumbling across and giving you a fresh perspective. And the combination of these two misconceptions often leads to many businesses implementing open floor plans in an effort to increase connection in the workplace and increase creativity. And the nuance here is that if implemented poorly, deep work can decrease connection and creativity, but it doesn't have to, because you can optimize for connection and creativity and deep work separately. You can have an environment where you have a central hub to connect with your colleagues or your fellow students and to facilitate that curiosity, but you also have spokes or isolated rooms where you can go and focus and work deeply. And so the thing here is it doesn't have to just be either or. You can optimize both deep work and connection and creativity separately to get the best out of both worlds. Now we've discussed why deep work is important and debunked many of the misconceptions around deep work. We can move on to some of the strategies that can help you actually start working more deeply. And we can break this down into 2 steps. How do we, number 1, increase the amount of deep work that we do? And number 2, increase the quality of the deep work. So number 1, to increase the amount of deep work that you perform in your day-to-day life, you need to do 2 things. Number 1, you need to actually prioritize deep work over shallow work. And number 2, you need to form the habit of doing deep work. And if you don't do these 2 things, then you're never going to actually get around to working deeply, no matter how important you think it is. And to prioritize deep work, well, we need to say no to shallow work. And this isn't always, because like we'll talk about in a second, you don't have to be doing deep work 100% of the time. However, you still need enough time to do it, and the first way to prioritize deep work is to say no to shallow work, or at least say no to enough shallow work to give you the time to actually work deeply. And when you're saying no, you want to, number 1, make sure that it's a very clear and decisive no. Number 2, you also don't want to provide a consolation prize. Don't say, no, I can't, but I will, say, review this part. Just say no. And the last one is to provide an unclear justification. Let's say you say, no, I can't attend this meeting. Don't give a reason. Don't say, because I have this other meeting, because then they can try and actually reschedule and make it work. Just say, I have a scheduling commitment, because then there's no real counter argument they can make. And to help you form the habit, you can have a set environment that you do deep work in, a place where you go where you only work deeply, because it will help your mind actually trigger into that flow state. And then one key factor that'll help you, number 1, prioritize, but number 2, also help you form the habit, is to set a clear time to work deeply and to work shallowly. And the one nuance here is that you can't actually work deeply 24/7. An expert only really has a maximum of 4 hours that they can usually work deeply, and a novice only really around 1. And so what you can do is you can consult with your boss to try and get a quota of how much deep and shallow work you can do, and then you can use that to actually justify how much work you're doing deeply or shallowly when you're saying no to maybe colleagues to set up other meetings. And here we've been introduced into 2 ideas that get repeatedly referred back to throughout the book. The first one is the idea of environmental optimization, where you have a set environment where you work in and you optimize it. And the second one is this idea of scheduling exactly when you're going to be doing deep and shallow work. And this idea of scheduling, like I said, we'll come back to multiple times. But when you're scheduling, the author also presents 4 key strategies of how and when you should be working deeply. The first strategy is the most extreme. It's this idea of complete seclusion of shallow work, where you do absolutely no shallow work, you only work deeply. This is only really even an option or a good idea if you have very clear and discrete outputs. An example of this is maybe you're an author. Because in this case, you could actually completely seclude yourself from society, go live in a cave or out in the country, and just work deeply your entire life. The issue, however, though, is although this is probably the best way to work deeply and you'll work the most, it's just incredibly impractical for most people's day-to-day lives. And not many people have the option just to go live in a cave or in the country. The second option, which is a little bit more practical, is this idea of periodically going and doing deep work. And so this could be you periodically take a month off, or every year you spend a certain number of months out in the country to dedicate yourself to deep work. Or this could be on more of a small scale where maybe 1 day every week you stay home to do deep work. Or 2 days you go into a different location to do deep work. But it's this idea of a periodic sort of repeating nature. And this is a little bit more practical. It still can be quite impractical on the extreme, like not many people have the ability to just go live in the country for 3 months every year. But it is potentially more viable. And especially that 1 or 2 days a week of pure deep work is a lot more viable in today's day and age where you can ask your boss to work from home. And then the third strategy, which is even more practical, is having a daily routine of deep work, where maybe every morning you try and fit in 3 to 4 hours of deep work. Because the beauty here is, like we said earlier, you can only really have 4 hours of real deep work every day. And so maybe you just do that in the morning, and then in the afternoon, you do all of your other shallow work commitments. And the final one is ad hoc, where effectively you just fit in deep work whenever you can. As soon as you have some downtime, you go and work deeply. The issue here, though, is this is a very bad strategy for novices, because you will end up just never working deeply. You'll never form the habit. And this is only an option where you're an expert. So as you can see, as you go towards the left, you actually end up doing a lot more deep work, but it becomes increasingly impractical. And so trying to find that balancing point where it's actually viable, but you're also working deeply is the goal. So if we can effectively prioritize and form the habit of deep work, we'll drastically increase the amount of deep work that we do. The next topic is how do we increase the quality of that deep work? And here we're introduced to 3 core factors. Number 1, you need to increase your foundational ability to focus, because focus isn't just a habit, it's a skill. And having that ability to focus is something that you need to develop. The second factor here is to increase your motivation during your deep work session. Because as we all know, it's usually a lot easier to work deeply when we're motivated. And usually most people's experiences with deep work or flow state is just before a deadline where they're incredibly motivated because they're incredibly stressed out. And then the third factor is to decrease distractions, which will break our focus and therefore derail our deep work. We'll start with how we can decrease our distractions. The first one is once again optimizing your environment. Remove your distractions. Optimally, you could work in a hub and spoke like model where you have a separate location to work deeply in your workplace. However, a lot of the time that's not in your control. So just do your best to optimize your environment and remove distractions. And this is the second time we're introduced into this idea of environmental optimization. The next 2 factors are 2 common distractions that prevail in our society right now. And these are those distractions which are leading into this idea of deep work becoming increasingly valuable, because these distractions are becoming increasingly common. The first one is decreasing the distractions you get from social apps. And the key here is to think of these apps more like tools. Because one core issue with social apps is they've become so prevalent in our society that even considering to stop using an app, say like Instagram or Facebook, is taboo. It seems unnatural. But the key here is you need to think of them like tools. Are they actually serving the purpose that you want them to? So the first thing here is you should consider actually quitting these apps, just like how you consider not using a tool. And the author presents a process to help you do this. Because you shouldn't just quit all social apps full stop. It's a nuanced decision. Just like how deciding what tool to use to maybe dig a hole can sometimes be a nuanced decision. You need to consider what are the pros and cons. And so the process the author lays out is setting, number 1, your goals. What are you trying to accomplish in your life and in your work? And this should just be a very short list on a very high level. Because with these goals, it'll give you clarity into the core actions that are really going to push you forward in your life and your career. What are the 2 to 3 core things that'll help you live the life that you want to live? And you'll want to cut it down to only 2 to 3 things. And this stems from the 80-20 rule, where it's usually 20% of the actions will lead to 80% of the results. Make sure that these actions are specific, something that you could actually visualize yourself doing in your mind, and something that's an ongoing activity, not just a once-off. And then with these actions, analyze the impact that these social apps are going to have on it. So an example here is maybe for your personal life, you want to stay connected with your close family. And you realize, well, what are the 2 to 3 actions you need to do? Well, maybe you need to spend more one-on-one time with each of your family members. And you want to consciously try and improve the way you communicate with your family, seeking first to actually understand and talk with them. And so then when you're considering the impact of social media apps on those 2 core actions, they're not going to actually positively impact either of them. They're not going to give you more time to spend with your family, and they're not going to improve your ability to communicate. And so the overall consequences are negative. In that case, you should try and quit that app for 30 days and then see what was the impact. Was it better or was it worse? If it was worse, you can go back and you can keep the app. But if it does actually improve your life, then you should permanently quit it. However, this isn't always the case. Let's say instead you're actually in the army. You've been deployed. And so you still want to maintain your relationships with your friends and family. But what are the core actions now? Well, it's number one, maybe spending more time FaceTime with your family. And maybe number two, spending more time communicating with your family and actually sending text messages to your family. In this case, maybe one of your social media apps is having a positive impact on that second action. Maybe having Instagram or Facebook is helping you actually stay connected with the community even though you're overseas. And in that case, it's positive, and so you should keep it. And so it's a nuanced decision. It's just like choosing what tool to use when you're, say, building a house. It's a nuanced decision, and you should balance the pros and cons and use that to make the decision. But as a whole, most of the time, we should consider quitting. For 90% of cases or 99% of cases, the social media apps, although they might have some benefits, their benefits do not outweigh their negatives, especially when we're considering the core actions that we really want to take to improve our life. And so for most people, it's going to be a good idea considering to quit a lot of your social media apps. The second factor is one which will also be applied to the ways that we should introduce to decrease the amount of email that we do. And that is actually scheduling when we use the internet. And this sounds extreme, but hear me out. And the thing here is, although the internet is an incredibly powerful tool for the workplace that we are in today, it's also a huge distraction. And so the best thing to do is to try and optimize the internet's utility, but minimize its impact on your ability to do deep work. And the way to do this is to schedule when to use the internet. Because if you can use the internet at any point, then we're going to be giving into distraction a lot easier. It's just too easy to go onto YouTube or Facebook. But if we only have a set time when we can use the internet, we can collect all the resources and all the things that it's actually useful for, and then later actually use those things throughout our workday without being distracted. And so you can have a set time where you go on the internet and you respond to your emails, you message your family, and you maybe collect all of the resources that you're going to need for all of your tasks for the rest of the day. But then outside of that, you do not use the internet at all. And although a lot of people can understand why that would be important, they usually give the counter argument of, yeah, that's great, but what if I'm in the middle of doing something and I really need to go and find a resource that someone sent me on an email, or I really need to Google something? Well, the key here is don't actually compromise. Because although you might need that, compromising on this habit and giving into distraction is going to have an overall net negative effect. So instead, what you should do is you should switch tasks and do something else until you have your next block of using the internet, and then you can come back to that. Because although it might be an inconvenience, it's the lesser of evils. And in the worst case, maybe there's nothing else you can do, or maybe this is due incredibly soon, the thing you need to do is at least wait 5 minutes. Even if it's due in half an hour, even if it's the most important task ever, wait 5 minutes, because 5 minutes isn't really going to impact anything, but it is going to help you build the habit of actually overcoming distraction. And we should also do this in our rest when we're actually taking breaks, because it can be very beneficial to ensure that you have appropriate rest and help you train your abilities to focus. And this is something that we'll come back to again when we touch on rest. And this is another example of scheduling that pops up in the book. And the final strategy we can use to decrease distraction is to decrease the number of emails that we get. Because emails are probably one of the biggest distractions that we face in our day-to-day lives currently. And by decreasing the number, we decrease its distraction. To do this, there are 2 factors we can implement. The first factor is to have a clear email policy. And this is comprised of 2 factors. First of all, you need to change the expectation of the sender of the email to understand that you're not always going to reply. One big issue with email is that everyone feels pressured into responding to every email they get. But not all emails are worth responding to. So you need to change the expectations of the sender. Maybe say, I do not always respond to emails, or I only respond to this kind of email. And that also bleeds into the second factor of having email filters, where maybe you only want emails of a certain type. You only want emails that are important, or you only want emails about this topic, because it's going to reduce the number of emails you get. If they don't actually fill that expectation or fill that requirement, then do not reply. That way, you'll get a lot less emails and a lot less useless emails in your inbox. And then the second strategy is to have clear, closed-ended rather than open-ended emails. So one of the biggest time drains are when you have very broad, open-ended conversations over emails, like, what are your thoughts on this? Or you're trying to organize a meeting and it takes 100 back and forth emails to find a time. What you want to do is to be very to the point, be very efficient. You need to identify what's the point of this email? What is the goal of this email? And where are we currently at? And how can I get from our current state to the goal state in the smallest number of emails as possible? And then you'll send very systematic, very thoughtful, very efficient emails and overall reduce the number of emails that it takes to communicate different things. And with those two factors, you can drastically reduce the number of emails. The other factor of scheduling internet usage, you can reduce your use of email overall and reduce its distraction. So we've now discussed all the methods that you can do to actually decrease the amount of distraction in your life. And we can move on to some of the methods you can use to increase the amount of motivation you have during your deep work sessions. The first one is one that isn't as practical for everyone, and that is a grand gesture. The idea here is if you make a huge grand gesture when you're doing your deep work, you're going to drastically increase the amount of motivation you'll have. And so what a grand gesture is a really big change in your environment and a really big investment as well. So an example might be moving to the country for a couple months or renting out a hotel specifically for the purpose of working in it. And this is what J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, did to write his last book. And by putting this big investment and having this huge change in your environment, it's a lot more motivating to actually get more deep work done. And this could also be linked to some of the strategies we discussed earlier about the best way to schedule your deep work, because this is often what people do when they use a periodic or seclusion strategy. However, any large change in environment or large investment will increase your motivation to focus during your deep work sessions. The second factor that you can use to increase your motivation during your deep work sessions is to have clear deadlines for when you need to get a task done. Because setting a deadline can motivate you. And this is why we usually get good deep work sessions in just before a dooming deadline. But we can utilize this for every task and every deep work session to further increase our motivation. And there's three factors you want to implement when you're setting a deadline. First of all, you want to have a clear metric that defines that deadline, a clear quantifiable goal. And when you're looking at this metric, it's best to use leading metrics rather than lagging metrics. So a leading metric is the sort of short-term controllable things that you put into the task, and a lagging metric is more the outcome of that task. So a leading metric would be the number of hours you spent studying, and a lagging metric would be your grade for a test. And you want to sort of set leading metrics because they're more controllable, they're more short-term, and so they're more motivating. Whereas a lagging metric, a lot of time is outside your control and it's more distant in the future, and so it's not as motivating in that day-to-day setting. You also want to make these goals very ambitious because then it's motivating, but not too ambitious that it's unrealistic and then becomes demotivating. So there's a fine balance when it comes to setting that ambition when it comes to goals. And then finally, you need to make that deadline clearly visible, both to you personally, but also publicly as well, because then you have an increased amount of accountability. And to make something personally visible, it comes back to that idea, once again, of scheduling. Because you can schedule in, I want to finish working on this by this time, and it's making a deadline clearly visible to yourself. And so that links in, once again, to this idea of scheduling as another reason why scheduling can be so important for deep work. And so those are the two factors that we can use to increase our motivation. And the final topic that is touched on throughout the book is how do you increase your ability to do deep work? And that is down to two factors. How can we train that skill of doing deep work? And how can we rest ourselves to make sure that we actually have the capacity to do deep work when we need to? So first of all, when you're training your ability to deep work, the key thing here is, like any skill, the more you do it, the more you'll train it. So if you increase your amount, you're also going to train that skill slowly. And this is why novices can only do around an hour of deep work a day, whereas experts can do around 4. Another way to train it is by specifically doing something that you know is very cognitively demanding. An example of this is memorization. The act of memorizing is actually a deep work activity. And so just like how doing any other deep work activity will train your brain, so will practicing memorization. And so in the book, he gives an example of trying to memorize a deck of cards using visual association techniques like memory palaces. Well, a lot of the time, I would largely recommend just practicing it through doing it with things you're already performing. And then the next factor is one that will both help you train your ability to have deep work, but also ensure that you're resting adequately. And that's this idea of planning your rest time. Because by planning your rest time, you can do it in a strategic manner that, number one, makes sure you're well rested, but also number two, means that you can train your ability to focus during your rest. And so this can be planning, reading a book, or exercising, but two key things he notes here are, number one, ensuring that when you're resting, you're accepting boredom. You're not constantly seeking out distractions and going to your phone and scrolling through Instagram. Because by accepting boredom and actually not letting into distraction, you're training your ability to focus. And you're also going to be more rested. Because just scrolling through your Facebook and being meaningfully distracted does not help you actually get rested and restored. The second thing he talks about is this idea of productive meditation. And this is where when you're resting and you're physically occupied, so maybe you're driving or exercising, but you're not mentally occupied, then you can actually meditate productively, where you're focusing on a single problem and trying to solve it. He lays out 3 steps to make this a possibility, where what you do is you define the variables, all of the facts and information relevant to the problem. You then establish the clear next step or next question that you need to answer to help solve the problem. And then once you've answered it, you can consolidate that information and start again. This process will help you stay focused on this one problem and also prevent you from just looping over the information over and over again and never really getting anywhere. And by practicing productive meditation, not only will you be productive, but it'll also help you train your ability to focus. And the final thing which can actually help us specifically rest more effectively is ritualizing our shutdown method. Ritualizing when we start resting. And so this is referring to the end of your workday, when you actually need to go through a clear ritual to ensure that you can let go of tasks and fully actually rest once your day is done. And so the clear thing here is you need to have a fixed starting time. Otherwise, it's going to bleed into the rest of your life. And to build a habit or a ritual, it needs to start at a consistent time. Then you want to clear your mind in this ritual. This will mean that you can let go of tasks. And so when you go home and you're resting, you actually are resting. And there's not all of these things on your mind. And you're not randomly checking emails. And so what you want to do here is a final check of all of your inboxes and tasks and calendars. Then do a little bit of task management, transfer anything on your mind onto a task list to do the next day. And finally, you can plan out the next day. By doing this, you know you haven't left anything behind and you know that everything is going to be okay. And so you can let it go and move on and actually enjoy and break during your rest. And then finally, you can end this ritual with a action, something that signifies the beginning of your rest period. And so what Cal Newport does is he says, shut down complete, which may sound dumb, but it helps you form that ritual. And all of these things, like planning your rest and having a fixed start time, once again links into this idea of scheduling your time. And to finish off the summary of this book, when you're scheduling all of these various things, from the times when you're working deep and shallow, and you're scheduling the time when you start resting and what you're doing during that rest, alongside your deadlines during work, and also when you're actually going to be using internet during your rest and your work, you want to make sure that you're using time blocking, where you're blocking out your time on exactly what to do. And the key thing here is this schedule is not set in stone. It's really just a tool to help you think about what should I do next. And you should constantly be adjusting your schedule throughout the day. It doesn't mean that you plan your day at the morning and then you try your best to keep up with everything, and at the end of the day you end up not doing any of it. You should be constantly adjusting your schedule to fit the things that are popping up with your day. And it's really just a tool to help you think about what should I be doing right now. And the second thing is to add buffers, because if we're starting to use these ambitious deadlines, a lot of the time it's not going to be done completely by the time you've set. So it's best to add in buffers to ensure that you can actually still set those ambitious deadlines, but you don't finish the day getting 1 out of the 20 things that you wanted to get done, because that's going to end up demotivating you. And the whole point of the ambitious deadlines is to motivate you. So you want to have both an ambitious deadline and a good buffer afterwards. But that's about it. That is deep work. And we've gone over why deep work is so important. We've debunked many of the misconceptions. And we've also talked about how to actually implement this in your day-to-day life, increasing the amount and the quality of the deep work that you actually perform. So hopefully you found that useful, and hopefully you actually implement some of these things in your day-to-day life to help you get more done in less time and ultimately live a happy and fulfilled life. If you're interested in more mind map, in-depth book summaries similar to this, feel free to subscribe to the channel. But apart from that, have a great day.